The silence of a hive world is never just silence. It is the collapse of millions of lives into a void where the humming of manufactoria once thundered without end, where vox traffic filled the air like a storm, where the march of billions of feet was as steady as a heartbeat. To walk into such silence is to step into the corpse of an empire, into the ruins of something that was never meant to die. And when the Inquisition arrives, they do not come searching for survivors. They come searching for answers, and perhaps to bury the truth before it can breathe. Before we plunge into the shadow of a vanished hive, remember to steady your own place in this galaxy of endless war. If you wish to keep uncovering the hidden corners of the Imperium, stand with us here, share this journey, lend your voice, and let the channel grow as a beacon. Subscribe, so that the next story may reach you before the silence does. The descent began with a vibration so faint, it barely stirred the Auspex needles. The gunmetal hull of the inquisitorial cutter shuddered as its void shields kissed the poisoned atmosphere of the hive world. Through the portholes, there was no shimmer of city lights, no lattice of energy grids burning against the clouds, only blackness, like an ocean with no surface. A hive world should never look like this. Even in night's embrace, there should have been the flicker of plasma discharge, the crawling constellation of transport craft, the vertical spires burning their presence into the smog-choked sky. Here, there was nothing. The planet rotated in silence, stripped of pulse, as though it had been placed in the void as a tomb. Inquisitor Histian remained motionless at the observation deck, his hood drawn, his gloved hand clasping a rosarius. He did not speak, not to his acolytes, nor to the stormtroopers standing rigid behind him. Only his eyes followed the planetary surface, watching the shadowed outlines of mountains that were not mountains at all but hive stacks, the skeletal spires of industry that stretched kilometers high. Once they had burned red with promethium flame, thundered with manufactoria hammerings that churned out weapons, armor, and supplies that fed half a sector's war machine. Now they were shapes in the dark, unlit and unbreathing. When the cutter pierced through the clouds, a choking pall of ash and chemical fog washed against its hull. The pilot's voice cracked through the Vox grill, strained but steady. "We have atmospheric breach. No Vox signatures, no transponder beacons. The hive is cold." Even the words themselves felt forbidden, as if uttering them was to trespass into a death that might still be watching. They made landfall on the outer causeway of Hive Braun, the largest of the planetary spires. The surface greeted them not with light or movement, but with the echo of boots on ferrocrete, unchallenged and unanswered. A hive world should have been deafening. The constant churn of masses, the hiss of vents, the shrieking of shuttle lifters, the shrill bark of enforcers keeping order with shock mauls. Instead, each step resounded in an emptiness that dwarfed them. The first impression was dust, not the gentle dust of forgotten libraries or undisturbed relics, but a thickness that spoke of collapse, fine ash clinging to armor joints, clogging rebreathers, streaking the black carapace of stormtrooper helms. Whole banners lay shredded across the causeway, their cloth stiff with soot. The imperial aquila, once painted bold upon gates and walls, was stripped to its outlines, eaten away by corrosion and neglect. It felt less like abandonment, and more like erasure. "Scan for Vox echoes," Histian commanded, his voice low without inflection. A servitor hunched over a data slate, its mechanical limbs twitching as Auspex feeds scrolled in unbroken silence. No signatures, no heat traces, not even the faint scuttling of vermin. The hive had not simply been deserted, it had been emptied, hollowed out like a carcass. The squad advanced through the entry gates, their lasguns raised, muzzles tracking the shadows that pooled in the vast arches. The gates yawned into the transit halls, those colossal arteries where once millions pressed shoulder to shoulder, day and night, cycling between shifts in the manufactoria. Now the halls stretched wide and barren, their floors strewn with fragments of clothing, dented ration tins, Vox beads snapped from chains, and scattered devotional charms. Yet no bodies, not even bones. The silence was heavier here, like a second atmosphere pressing against the eardrums. One of the acolytes, a young woman named Sariel, dared to whisper, "It feels wrong, master," as if they left in one breath, all at once. Hestian's gaze flicked toward her but gave no rebuke. His silence was the rebuke, and it pressed heavier than any words. The torchlight from the stormtroopers' lamps carved shapes into the walls, propaganda frescoes depicting the Emperor's might, now flaking and water-streaked. Figures of saints loomed, their faces obscured by soot stains that resembled tears. Further in, the team reached a transit hub, a cavernous dome, where dozens of mag rail lines once carried workers deeper into the hive. The rails were silent, carriages halted mid-track, some doors still ajar, as though passengers had stepped out moments before. Inside, abandoned lunch pails rusted where they sat, cups overturned, parchments fluttered faintly in the recycled air. But the air recyclers themselves had ceased, leaving only a stillness that clung like cobwebs. Stormtrooper Callius lifted his vox bead, adjusting the channel. Still nothing, even background static's gone. It's like the whole world stopped transmitting. His words echoed through the dome, swallowed by the sheer absence. It was then that Hestian spoke. At last, silence itself is a message. The question is, to whom was it sent? Those words lingered as they pressed deeper, boots crunching on glass shards scattered across the ferrocrete. Here, the hive smelled of oil long dried, of incense burnt to black crust, of stagnant water dripping unseen. Every sense screamed absence, yet in absence lay the suggestion of something waiting. The silence was not passive, it watched them, thick with potential, like a stage set for an audience that had never left but merely hidden. By the time they reached the Manufactoria gates, the magnitude of the void pressed upon even the hardened stormtroopers. Before them towered the entry to Forge District 9, its gates rusted, chains dangling loose, a place that should have thundered with 1,000 engines, where sparks once flew in golden arcs and labor hymns roared beneath cathedral rafters. Now the gates moaned as the squad forced them open, and beyond was only darkness. The Inquisitor raised his hand, halting the advance. His gaze swept the blackened interior, where columns of machinery stretched into unseen heights. "Record everything," he said. "Every fragment, every absence. We are standing in a wound, and wounds tell stories if one dares to look." And with that, the Inquisition crossed into the dead Manufactoria, each lamp piercing the void like a prayer cast into a starless night. The Manufactoria swallowed them whole. Their lamps clawed through darkness, picking out the shapes of assembly lines that once marched with the precision of legions. Conveyor belts stood motionless, half-forged las rifles, still lying unfinished, their metal shells rusted where they had been left mid-process. Looming cranes hung frozen over broken molds, their chains dripping with condensation, each drop echoing in the silence like a slow clock. Every machine was still, but it was not the stillness of maintenance or shutdown. It was abandonment, abrupt and permanent, as though workers had been torn from their posts mid-motion. The stormtroopers spread into a disciplined formation, lasguns raised, visors glowing faintly, their boots pressed through a carpet of ash and filings that crumbled into powder at every step. At one workstation, Sariel knelt to lift a data slate from the floor. Its screen was cracked, the glass etched by long scratches that looked less like accident and more like panic. When she powered it, a single fragment blinked into life, a half-finished hymn logged by a worker, its verses praising the Emperor's strength in the hour of labor. The final line cut off mid-syllable, leaving a blank screen and a faint hum that guttered before dying entirely. Nothing was finished, Sariel murmured, voice muffled through her rebreather. Not the weapons, not the songs, not even the food in the carriages. They didn't leave willingly. "Then something took them," replied Stormtrooper Callius, his words harsh. "No planet vanishes without a trace." He swept his lamp across the rafters above, where catwalks threaded between colossal smokestacks. Nothing moved, but the beams illuminated smears along the railings, blackened streaks, as though hands had gripped them with desperate strength, dragging until the flesh burned away. Deeper still they came upon a chapel embedded in the manufactoria's wall, its doors ajar. In every hive, the faith of the workers is sustained by shrines, and here too they found one. But the chapel reeked of something wrong. The air was heavy with incense that had long ago soured into rot. Its burners tipped and their contents spilled across the marble floor. Candles had guttered down into puddles of hardened wax, frozen in strange spirals. The statue of the emperor loomed cracked, one arm broken away, its remaining hand stretched outward, as though reaching for something unseen. Upon the altar lay scattered devotionals, rosaries snapped in half, parchment prayers torn mid-word, vox grills smashed into silence. Hestian's footsteps echoed as he entered, his shadow bending across the fractured face of the emperor's likeness. He laid his hand upon the altar and closed his eyes. None of his acolytes dared to break the moment. When he finally spoke, his words were hushed, like one speaking in the presence of something sacred and profane at once. Faith does not shatter in silence, it shatters under pressure. This world did not lose its faith by neglect. It was stolen. A tremor stirred beneath their feet. At first it was faint, the kind of vibration caused by settling metal. But then it came again. Stronger, a low thrum that seemed to travel through the walls themselves. Stormtroopers snapped into readiness, lamps jerking toward the shadows, auspex needles spiked, registering something vast moving far below, beyond measurable depth. Then just as suddenly, the signal dropped, leaving only the stillness once more. Seismic? Callius asked. The servitor clicked through its auspex calculations. Negative, no tectonic activity, no natural source. The silence seemed to deepen, as though the hive itself had inhaled. Hestian turned, his cloak brushing the ash. Downward he commanded. Whatever answers lie here, they lie beneath. The squad obeyed, filing through the manufactoria's interior arteries into the freight shafts that led toward the hab levels below. The air grew thicker, heavier with every descent. Stale chemicals clung to the back of their throats, metallic and acrid. The walls here bore signs of struggle, handprints smeared along the panels, some dragged in long arcs toward the floor, as though the owners had been pulled against their will. Vox receivers embedded in the walls hung cracked and silent, their wires coiling like entrails. At the first hab block, they found the apartments frozen in abandonment. Doors hung open, cots unmade, ration packs half-eaten. A child's toy lay shattered at the threshold of one chamber, a carved wooden aquila, its wings broken in two. In another, pick screens flickered faintly with static, casting stuttering light upon empty rooms. There were signs of panic, but not of resistance. No blood spatter, no weapon discharge, no barricades. It was as though the population had been lifted out, carried away by some invisible hand that left the dust untouched. Suriel paused before a pick slate still fixed to the wall, its last image frozen, a family captured in grainy monochrome, their faces gaunt yet proud, their hands joined in prayer before a shrine. The slate flickered once, distorted, before dying. She drew back sharply, whispering through her vox. They were here, they were real. And now, her words trailed off, unable to shape the thought. The deeper they pressed, the more oppressive the silence became. No vermin scuttled, no pipes hissed with steam. Even the recycled air seemed unwilling to stir. Yet the faint tremor returned, steady now, like the beating of something vast buried in the earth. Not constant, but rhythmic, a pulse. By the time they reached the freight elevator shafts, the stormtroopers were tense, fingers on triggers, lamps darting across shadowed recesses. The elevator itself hung rusted, its cables frayed as though gnawed by something more deliberate than time. And in the shaft walls, scratches ran deep, curling in patterns too wide for human fingers. Inquisitor Hestian stood at the edge, staring into the abyss below. His rosarius glimmered faintly in the lamp glow. "This is not abandonment," he murmured. "It is consumption." The word hung in the air like a blade unsheathed. The elevator cages were dead, but the shaft service ladders still clung to the wall like vertebrae. Hestian clipped on, tested the magnet locks with a curt pull, and started down. The retinue followed in silence, boots kissing rungs slick with condensation, lamps painting the shaft in slow, lurching slices of light. The deeper they went, the stronger the pulse became, a pressure felt not through the ears but through bone and teeth, as if the hive carried a buried heartbeat. Each thrum sent a tremor through the ladder. Each tremor sent a whisper of dust spiraling into the dark below. They emerged onto a mid-depth gantry that opened into the sump levels, where waste channels and drainage arteries once bled the hive's excess into filtration towers. The air here was colder. The lamps found their way across riveted plate and dripping pipes, across warning stencils rubbed to smears, across stacks of rusted drums with hazard runes, scabbed over by time. No vermin, no chemflies, not even the algae crust that should have lacquered the moisture gutters. Absence again, but honed to a needlepoint. Callias raised a closed fist, halting the file. His lamp cut a line across the gantry's dust. There were footprints at the edge, dozens, then hundreds. Bare feet, booted feet, small feet that could only have belonged to children, all marching in the same direction, toward a maintenance door scored with the sigil of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The prints overlapped and bent like currents, then stopped at the threshold, vanishing into smooth metal, as if the door were a pool they had stepped into, and never broken. Sariel crouched, tracing the nearest impression with a gloved finger. They weren't running, she whispered. They were ordered. Her lamp drifted to the door's seal. It had been sanctified long ago. Machine oils and incense worked into the seams, until it gleamed with an almost religious sheen. Now the seal was broken, the sanctum signs half melted, as though a heat had passed over them without flame. Hestian gestured to the servitor. Cables unreeled, skull plugs slotted, and the thing's augmetics flickered with a low chitter as it negotiated with the door spirit. The panel protested with a stuttering cascade of dead Binheric. Then, like a cough from an old throat, it unlocked. The door slid back on rails that screamed once and then fell silent, revealing a narrow corridor falling away at a shallow angle. Cold exhaled through the gap, heavy with a damp that smelled not of sump, not of machine, but of stone and old air. They moved in. The corridor's walls bore maintenance catechisms etched at regular intervals, now scored by long scratches that curved and crossed as if made by hands that could not hold tools correctly. The pulse was louder here, closer. The stormtroopers held formation, muzzles steady, trigger discipline perfect. The floor's dust lay disturbed in two precise lines, as though something had been dragged with ritual care, again and again, until the metal polished itself beneath the burden. The passage opened into a sub-hub, a round chamber with 5 branching tunnels, and a small shrine bolted to the central pillar. Its candles had flowed down in petrified waves, congealing into a pale collar. An auto-lectern stood before it, a ragged servo voice box still attached. Hestian touched the key. The vox crackled, coughed, then found a voice that did not belong to any of them. A thin, quavering tone, devotional in cadence. Shift cycle ends at the word. Procession forms at the word. The voice is the word. The machine fell silent, then sparked again with a child's laugh smothered into static. Hold hands so you do not fall. Hold hands. Hold. The rest died in a shriek of ruptured wire. Callias glanced at Hestian. The Inquisitor's features did not change, but his eyes had fixed on the tunnels, weighing something unseen. We follow the polished track, he said. Whatever moved here, moved with purpose enough to wear metal. They took the left-hand way. Behind them, the auto-lectern twitched once more, and spat a final whisper that might have been a prayer or a warning. Do not look back when you hear your name. It was easier not to think about the names the hive had held, 1 billion of them, now swallowed. The tunnel sloped steeper until their boots found stairs. The pulse became a drumbeat, slow and patient, too regular for geology, and too alive for machinery. The lamps pulled a chamber from the dark, a wide vault cut from bedrock, and braced with steel ribs. Its ceiling hung with lengths of chain ending in empty manacles, not for restraint, for order. Long tables stood in rows, each bolted to the floor, each gouged by cutlery or tools. On every table, centered with ritual neatness, lay a single ring of oxidized metal, no wider than a crown, Sariel lifted one and turned it in her palm. Its inner rim was smooth, its outer rim scored by the impressions of teeth. It had been chewed, not to break free, but as if tasting obedience. Augmetic connector collars, she breathed, and then shook her head. No, not quite. There is no lock assembly, no coupling. She set it down gently, as if setting down the idea itself. At the far end of the vault, a gate of thick bars divided the rock. Its center held a Mechanicus seal plate driven in with ceremonial nails. The plate had been buckled from the other side, its runes distorted like flesh pressed against glass. Around the lock, wax seals lay scattered like shed skins. The polished tracks led here, bright as a mirror. Hestian stepped to the gate and leaned close, listening. The pulse was not beyond, it was beneath, a depth beneath depth. The scent of the air that breathed through the bars was wrong for a hive, wrong for a dead world. It carried a trace of salt, the memory of great water moving in darkness. This planet held no oceans. Callias smelled it too. He glanced at Sariel, and she did not meet his eyes. "Open it," Hestian said. No raise in tone, only the weight of command that accepted whatever would answer. The servitor went to work, cables hissing, digits ticking. The gate's mechanism resisted in slow jerks, like a jaw clenched against a forced yawn. Each bar shuddered, each nail squealed where it had been hammered through litany-stamped tin. With a final crack, something relented, and the gate drew back an arm's span. Cold slid past them, beating their armor with fine damp. The pulse skipped, once, just once. The break in the rhythm felt like a hand withdrawing from a shoulder. The retinue's lamp speared into the gap, and found a staircase cut into natural stone, steps worn concave by countless feet. On the first riser, in crusted ink, someone had written a single word, hush, not a warning, an order. They started down, the chains above sang a thin note in the wake of their passage, and the vault's emptiness swallowed the sound. Chapter 2. Ash, Bone, and Shadows of Faith. The descent from the cavern did not return them to industry, but to devotion. Where the manufactoria had ended in salt and silence, the next levels opened into worship. Cathedrals were fused into the hive's very skeleton, halls carved as arteries of belief, their ceilings lost in the smoke dark. Here incense should have burned without pause, rising in thick coils to stain stained glass, and choirs should have thundered praise to the throne with the discipline of armies. But the smoke had long since thinned, leaving only its clinging stench on stone. The choir lofts stood empty, their hymnals scattered on the floor like broken wings. The stormtroopers moved cautiously down the nave of the first great chapel. Pews lay overturned, as though in flight. Banners embroidered with the imperial creed drooped, their fabric rotted into lace. Candles had guttered to spires of hardened wax that leaned together like mourners. The altar still bore the gilded aquila, its twin heads fractured along the join, so that one beak pointed skyward and the other drooped downward, broken. Upon the altar cloth lay dozens of bones arranged with ritual neatness, each finger bone stacked in ascending order, each skull stripped of jaw. Sariel bent to study the offering. Her rebreather hissed faintly. They were cleaned, not by scavenging, by hands. She traced one with a gloved fingertip. The cut was clean, the marrow scraped. As if prepared, Callias shifted uneasily, his lasgun trained on the aisles. What kind of rite takes jaws? Hestian did not answer at once. He stood before the altar, hand brushing the edge of the cloth, feeling the grit that had collected there. His eyes lifted to the apse, where frescoes once displayed the emperor enthroned amid saints and martyrs. But the paint had blistered away. In its place was a scrawl, carved into plaster with obsessive precision, line after line, repeating the same phrase. We opened our mouths and he spoke. The words crawled from floor to ceiling, climbing the curves of the dome like ivy. The letters grew smaller as they reached the highest vaults, cramped, desperate, as if the writer had climbed upward, carving until they could no longer cling to the stone. The squad's lamps swept across the transept, Other chapels yawned, their doors ajar, shadows spilling like liquid. In one, the walls had been painted entirely black, save for hundreds of handprints pressed in pale ash, layered until they formed shapes that resembled wings. In another, devotional icons had been nailed face down, their wood backs bristling outward like scales. Prayer books had been torn into strips and woven into ropes that hung from the rafters. Everywhere, the evidence of faith twisted under pressure, not abandoned, but redirected. The retinue pressed deeper, passing through cloisters where the air grew damp with mildew. Stone fountains stood cracked and dry, their statues worn to featureless lumps. Devotional candles floated half-melted in stagnant water, their wicks gnawed by mold. Surreal paused before a fountain where someone had scrawled words in rust brown across the basin. The water remembers. She dipped her gloved finger into the muck. It came away sticky. Not water, not rust, something dried that had once lived. At the edge of the cloister, they found a reliquary chamber. Its iron gates were flung wide, the lock twisted until the metal looked melted. Inside, reliquaries lay open, their contents stripped. The glass cases that had once displayed the finger bones of saints, the skulls of martyrs, the shrouds of blessed dead were all shattered. In their place stood arrangements of stone and bone, stacked into spirals that leaned against one another without mortar. The spirals circled inward toward the center, where a single jawbone sat atop a plinth, its teeth bound with thin wire, as if to hold them closed. Callias muttered a curse under his breath, then louder. "This isn't worship, this is desecration." Hestian's voice was low, but it carried. To them it may not have been. Faith is not always measured in what we recognize. Surreal glanced at him, eyes wide behind her visor. "You think they believed this was for him?" Hestian turned from the plinth. His cloak trailed across the dust. "Belief and truth are not twins. They are cousins who often meet only at funerals." The pulse from below still pressed at their bones, but here in the reliquary, it seemed to mingle with another rhythm. Not sound, not vibration, but memory, the sense of voices lingering just outside hearing, chanting in procession, countless throats speaking the same word over and over, until it lost meaning. The squad felt it without speaking, a heaviness that made their lips dry. At the far end of the chamber, a side door led into a vestry. The stormtroopers forced it open with a metallic shriek. Inside, the chamber was small, lined with shelves of vestments. Most had rotted to threads, but along the walls, pinned in neat rows, hung masks made of hammered tin. Each was featureless save for a jaw that had been cut away. The masks grinned with hollow mouths, their edges lined with ash. Dozens of them, enough to outfit a procession. Surreal stepped back, one hand rising instinctively toward her own rebreather. They stripped themselves, they made themselves mouths. Callias' grip on his lasgun tightened until his knuckles whitened beneath the glove. Mouths for what? No one answered. The Inquisitor's eyes lingered on the masks, then on the faint dust where their edges had scraped as they were lifted from hooks. He touched one, tilting it toward the light. The tin was worn smooth at the temples, as though many foreheads had pressed there for long hours. He set it back gently, the mask's grin facing the chamber once more. When he spoke, his voice was colder than the stone around them, for whatever they thought was listening. They left the vestry to a corridor, tiled with devotional mosaics. The tesserae lifted in strips, as if a careful hand had peeled pictures from the floor to carry them away. The air sharpened with a metallic tang, and their lamps flared on rows of confessionals set into the wall like black mouths. The wooden doors were ajar. Inside the first booth, a kneeler lay polished horn smooth by years of penitence. A vox auricular grill had been fixed where a priest's ear should have been. Hestian leaned close and found the grill wired not to a sacristy, but to a junction box bolted into the paneling, its seal stamped with cog and skull, and a string of benedictions. Sariel traced the cable with a hand lamp and frowned. It did not lead to any altar or choir loft. It dove into the hive's ribs, downward. They opened 5 more confessionals. Each had the same graft, Auriculars fed into machine junctions, bolted benedictions, rivets smoothed by fingers that sought forgiveness and found circuitry. In the sixth booth, a parchment had been tacked above the grill. The penmanship was precise, almost tender. "Do not wait for the priest. The voice absolves when it is ready." Below, the wooden screen had been gnawed smooth along its lower edge, as though a chin had rested there night after night, listening. Their path widened into the transept of a greater basilica. The floor was a geometry of inlaid iron, circles nested in circles, each ring marked with numbers cut into the metal at regular intervals. Kalia stepped to the outermost and ran a gloved thumb across a numeral. It had been overcut, deepened as if reinforced after the metal first softened. "Counting bodies," he said, "not time." Opposite lay the choir pit, sunken like a wound. Racks for hymnals stood empty, cables coiled in the trench where choristers' feet should have scuffed decades of polish. Serial vaulted down and worked the casing of a dusty Vox amplifier with a service knife. The casing came free, and a stink of old insulation rose like a ghost. Inside, instead of valves and coils, she found little leather pouches stitched shut and wired into place like capacitors. She slit one. It held a ring of teeth bound in wire like a rosary. She drew in breath, steadying her hands. They made the choir sing through what they took. Hestian said nothing. His lamp had found a mural on the apse, a saint with hands uplifted, palms scarred in stigmata, mouth opened in painted cry. The face had been carefully scraped away and repainted, not as a face, as a mirror sheen of beaten tin, a flat oval where reflection shivered and broke under his light. Around the saint's throat, the artist had engraved a line of text that wove through the gold leaf like a suture. "We lend the breath that was given, for breath is not ours." Past the apse lay a sacristy, whose stone floor had settled into a shallow basin. At the center, a font had been sunk into the rock and ringed with rails. The water within did not ripple under their lamps. It was too thick. It held the light like glass. Serial dipped the end of a chem strip and watched the panel change through a ladder of colors. She shook her head once. "Salt's too high for potable. Iron trace promethium film. Something proteinaceous. This is not baptistry water." Kalia studied the railings. Each post bore a nick at the same height, the exact point where a hand might tap while passing. The pattern repeated around the font, a choreography pre-etched into devotion. He looked at Hestian. "Procession again. Habit is the Imperium's first engine," Hestian said, and his tone made it difficult to tell whether he meant that as praise or warning. They crossed through dormitories for lay clergy, rows of narrow pallets, lockers stripped bare, footlockers, pried with disciplined force. Between two cots, a stack of data slates lay under a torn blanket, as if someone had hidden them with the instinct of a child. Serial woke the lowest with a tapped catechism. The slate answered, not with scripture, but with a confessor's log, voice only. The speaker's tone was weary and clean, the way old steel sounds when struck. Litany for the 30th day of silence. Petitioners attend in rings. Minors first, that they be accustomed early. We bind the jaws not to still them but to tune them. The voice praises obedience. It will not be angered if we are steady. It will not be angered if we are steady. A pause, a long exhale near the vox. "I have written to the Ordo Manurus of the Mechanicus." Their reply was sealed. "I did not open it. I did not open it." The log ended. Serial checked the next slate. The file header was simple. Day 31. The playback stuttered, found its place. The voice asked for names. I gave my own. It repeated it perfectly. Then it asked for the names of the children who had not attended. I sinned. I lied. It knew. It forgave me. It forgave me. The breath again, a tremble this time. I wrote to the Ordo Manurus a second time. The seal bears the cog. I did not open it. Hestian listened without taking the slate from her hands. "Find the seals," he said. "Somewhere in these rooms is the refusal we need." They found them in a drawer beneath a misericord, carved with consolations, 3 wax cylinders stamped with cog and skull, wrapped in ribbon inscribed with Benharic cordices. Serial broke the first and fed it into a reader. The machine spat out neat, clipped cant. It was not a reply. It was authorization, maintenance of emergent phenomena within non-standard acoustic infrastructures, priority catechism alignment to preserve production morale. A line of signatures followed, anonymous, perfect. Caelius' visor tilted. They sanctioned it. They permitted it. Hestian corrected, almost gently. Sanction suggests guilt. He turned the second cylinder in his fingers, listening not with ears, but with a habit of attention sharpened by years. He slid it into the reader. This one was shorter. Observe and report. Deviation from prescribed ring geometries may result in resonance failure. Do not introduce new names outside the workroll. The last clause was underlined in machine red. Do not introduce new names. The third seal cracked and flaked in his hands. It had been fired too hot. The ribbon fell away, and the message within was scrambled into noise. Through the stutter, 3 words emerged and vanished, like fish beneath dark water: vector, amplitude, choir. They stood in the quiet of the dormitory for a long breath. Outside, somewhere in the basilica's stone, the pulse made itself felt, a slow wordless syllable placed against bone. Caelius' hand tightened on his weapon, and then eased, a professional's correction. If the Mechanicus blessed this, someone witnessed it. Someone wrote a log. Someone filed a report. Someone did, Hestian said. And then someone made sure the report read, as if it were about vents, and valves and choir rails that needed polishing. He returned to the dormitory doorway, and looked back once, taking in the symmetry of empty cots, and the neatness that lingers after people who have learned to fold their lives small. We don't have to prove intent, he added, almost to himself, only pattern. They moved on, through a cloister that led to a side chapel sunk low against the hive's outer wall. The door was newer than the hinges, oiled to a soft sheen. Inside, the room was almost bare. A single lectern stood at the far end, holding a book bound in dark leather. The book was chained, but the chain was slack, the lock clipped and folded back on itself in a deliberate knot. Hestian set a hand on the cover, and felt heat, not from flame, but the warmth of something recently held. He opened to the first page. The script was beautiful, Ministorum rubric, a scribe's hand. Then 3 pages in, the letters began to thin, to slope, to echo themselves. They doubled and tripled like a voice in a stone hall, until lines of text ran together in palimpsest, words written over words, all of them the same sentence chasing itself down the page. We opened our mouths and he spoke. At the bottom where the quill had juddered and blotted, another sentence forced its way through, like a new route through old brick. He wants the names we do not give. Hestian closed the book. The warmth in the cover was gone. From somewhere beyond the chapel, metal ticked, the cooling sound of a machine just powered down, the after-song of current leaving wire. Caelius looked toward the nave. Serial drew her lamp. The tick came again, farther this time, like a step measured along a rail. It's still wired, Serial said. Even with the world dead, some circuit is completing itself. Then we'll find where it finishes, Hestian said, and there was something in his tone that held both patience and an old anger. He gestured, and they moved, the squad flowing back toward the transept, past the mirrored saint, past the pit whose teeth had sung. The tick stepped away from them, precise, polite, as if inviting them to follow at a respectful distance. They did. The ticking guided them along the basilica's flank, and into a corridor braced with arches that looked too slender to carry their own shadows. The sound was never ahead, by more than a dozen paces, measured and formal, like a metronome, accompanying a prayer too quiet to hear. The corridor ended at a pair of doors banded in iron and overpainted with Ministorum red. Their seals had been split without violence, cut clean and set aside with the care of a sacristan who intends to reseal them later. Hestian pressed his palm to the wood. Warmth bled through his glove, not heat, but the aftertouch of a hand. He leaned in and listened. The ticking stopped on the far side, as if it had been waiting for his ear. They entered a chamber built around an instrument that was not an organ, but had the posture of one. Pipes rose in ranks like a metal forest. Between them, arrays of vox horns faced inward toward a conductor's dais. Beneath the dais, A nest of cables rested in bowls where incense would have smoldered, each cable tagged with neat parchment labels bearing workroll numbers and catechism titles in a clerk's careful hand. The keyboard had no keys. In their place, rows of trigger teeth had been mounted, molars, premolars, canines, each wired and soldered along the gum line into a contact bar. When Serial brushed one with a probe, a faint tone sounded in the pipework, a letterless vowel that vibrated the ribs. Callius circled the dais, the grip of his lasgun leaving a fine trail in the dust. "Corpsmaster's place," he said. He tapped the toe of his boot against the step. Hollow, he crouched, slid a blade under the panel lip, and lifted. The cavity beneath held tools, bone saws polished to a mirror, forceps, wire threaders, clamps crusted with old rosin, where someone had lashed teeth into strings to keep them in order. A ledger lay atop the tray, wrapped in cloth. Serial unrolled it, and breathed out. It was immaculate, columns for date, ring, count, loss, yield, under yield, resonance stable, resonance thin, resonance broken. Occasionally, a note in a smaller hand, "Do not use the names twice." Hastian skimmed the columns with a glance that seemed to register every line and tally without lingering on any. He closed the ledger and replaced it exactly where he had found it, as if disturbing its memory would give it a reason to stop being honest. A small door opened at the back of the chamber. It led into a gallery that overlooked a lower hall. Down there, benches had been bolted into arcs facing a bank of vox horns. The benches had no backs. Chains lay coiled beneath each, the kind that fix ankles not to keep people from fleeing, but to keep them from stepping before the time is named. On the far wall, a large slate had been mounted and gridded into squares. Names filled each square in chalk, hundreds of them, thousands, written and wiped, and written again, until the slate was grayed by ghosts of prior lists. Along the bottom, a neat rubric, absent, ill, rotated, withheld. Under withheld, a column of names had been crossed with a straight line, and then overwritten with a single character, an open circle. Serial touched the chalk with her glove. It left no mark, the dust had absorbed all oil. "Withheld," she said softly. "Who withholds, and from whom?" "Perhaps the only mercy left," Hastian said. "Or the final cruelty." He was looking not at the slate, but at the floor beneath the front bench. A shallow tray lay there, long as a man and a handspan deep, its interior lined with wax scored into channels. At its head, a spout fed into a catchment pipe that vanished into the wall. The wax was marked with old cuts and little dimples where something small and hard had settled and been lifted away. A sigil had been scratched into the tray lip by an impatient instrument, an aquila rendered with such haste that one wing bent downward like a broken arm. Callius had moved to the bank of vox horns. A box there bore a switch, marked with a ministorum blessing and a Mechanicus safety rune. He glanced at Hastian. The Inquisitor tilted his head by a fraction. Callius flipped the switch. Pipes breathed, not loudly, a draft, a lung learning to draw air again. The horns whispered with the sound of distant air ducts. Then something else joined, almost inaudible, a murmur that resolved itself into phonemes, arranged without words. The sound a mouth makes when testing the edges of a language for the first time. It came in a narrow band, as if played back through a filter designed more to honor than to replicate. Serial leaned close, eyes narrowing. "Recordings," she said, "not of hymns, of breaths." They sampled breaths. A light winked on in the corner of the gallery, a little green eye behind a brass grill. Serial crossed the floor in 3 strides and opened the grill. A cogitator core squatted inside, its casing stamped with a manufactorum serial that belonged 2 districts away. She slid a wafer into the slot and brought the machine awake. The screen's glow turned her visor into a pale mask. Lines of Benharic marched by, then resolved into low Gothic when she knuckled the translate stud. Choir engine log, sub-circuit 7. Deviation within acceptable amplitude. Child ring integrated. Supervisor note, Additional names requested spontaneously by signal origin, recommending lockout until workroll aligns. Override received, lockout denied. Underneath, a signature composed of a single initial and a seal code that validated itself with a cheerful beep. Kalius' jaw set. This is not ignorance. This is administration. It is one of the Imperium's many faces, Hestian said, and there was no heat in it, only a cold that had waited a long time to be named. We will not change its features here. A shiver passed through the pipes, a ripple that rolled from the lowest rank to the highest, like a breeze climbing a stair. The horns trembled. The lights on the cogitator went from green to amber, then steadied. The murmur sharpened. It began to form a syllable, not a word, a name, not Serial's this time. Another, one none of them shared. Hestian spoke before it finished, each word measured as if staking out ground. Stand ready to sever power. He looked to Serial, trace the main, find me the junction where this engine stops being pious and becomes a wire. She nodded, already unspooling cable tracers from her kit, already reading the wall's hidden veins. Kalius flipped the switch back to cold. The murmur stumbled and fell, leaving the chamber with the sound of empty pipes. The green lamp returned to stillness. They followed the trunk cables out through a maintenance door, and into a spine corridor that ran along the basilica's exterior wall. Two sets of conduits parted there, one wrapped in Ministorum red braid, the other in Mechanicus black. Both headed downward into a service well, whose ladder was slick with oil new enough to shine. Hestian paused on the rim, and let the light fall down the shaft. It was not a long drop. The glow slid over a junction box the size of an altar, and then collected on the face of a man who stood beside it. He was not a servitor. His eyes moved, and in them lived the unmistakable cadence of thought. He wore a sacristan's robe hitched at the waist with wire. The robe was clean where hands would show, and black where shoulders would carry. A mask of hammered tin hung at his chest by a cord. He did not reach for a weapon. He lifted both hands, palms out. His lips had the puckered, careful look of wounds that have been sutured many times in the same place. I will not run, he said. His voice was tired, but it did not shake. I stayed to watch the lights go out in order. That is my service. If you intend to end it, do so with clean hands. Kalius had his weapon trained before the last word finished. Serial's tracers still gleamed between her fingers, paused mid-throw. Hestian lowered himself onto the ladder, each rung a soft click under his boots. Halfway down, he stopped where they were face to face, but not yet within reach. He studied the man with a gaze that made confessionals unnecessary. What is your name? Hestian asked. The sacristan's eyes flicked once toward the cables that vanished into the box. I was told not to give it, he said, but the voice knows it anyway. Give it to me, Hestian said, and the weight of the words made refusal feel like a kind of theft. The man swallowed, his stitches tugged. Brother Albin, he said. Ring keeper. I kept them in step. The lights along the box's edge ticked, one after the other, a traveling green that moved like beads under a thumb. Somewhere in the stone beyond, the pulse counted them in.
Chapter 3. The Whispers in the Deep Habs. The Habs began as geometry and ended as memory. Above, the basilicas had given their order a liturgy of stone. Below, the world narrowed into corridors, painted the color of fatigue. Number-stenciled doors lined the passages at exact intervals, each with a peephole clouded by breath that would never clear. Laundry lines sagged between bulkheads, still pinned with garments that had faded to the hue of old teeth. In places, whole walls had been skinned to their wiring, as if the hive had shed to keep cool. The retinue moved through the low light of emergency strips that had not fully died, their glow fluttering like eyelids, struggling to stay open. Every sound felt unearned. Even the soft clack of Hestian's boots found no echo, as if the Habs had swallowed the trick of reflection to keep their secrets intact. Brother Albin walked ahead under guard, his hands bound but steady, his mask of tin swinging like a pendulum from the cord at his throat. He knew the turns without looking. He paused at corners before the squad reached them, listening with the posture of someone raised by clocks. "You will hear it," he said once, not turning his head, not like a voice, like a habit that remembers you. Callias gave him a look that was almost kind, and then wasn't. "If the habit remembers me, it can forget just as quickly." They took a service stair whose steps had been worn to shallow basins by the passage of countless feet. The basins matched the cadence of children, and the weighted strides of those who carried more than themselves. On the second landing, a mural had been painted directly on the ferrocrete, a ring of figures holding hands. Each face had been left blank for anyone to imagine themselves within it. Serial lifted her lamp. Between the figures ran a thin silver thread pressed into the paint while it was wet, an unbroken circle anchored at a single knot behind one faceless head. Her gloved nail traced it. It thrummed very gently, not with power, but with the memory of tension. The air changed as they pressed deeper. It picked up the skin salt of people who had lived hard in small rooms. Beneath it lay the brittle smell of scrubbers run past their endurance, a metallic sweetness that clung to the tongue. Somewhere a drip measured time. Somewhere else, something soft dragged along a floor and stopped when lamps swung. Serial checked the auspex against her hip. It registered mass where there should have been none, absence where there should have been bulkhead, as if the habs had grown cavities and filled them with nothing. She shook the unit once to settle the needles and got the same answer, only calmer. They came to Habstack Theta down, identified by a stencil whose edges had been patted smooth by generations of hands. The main corridor split into two narrower alleys. Albin nodded to the left without being asked. "Assembly route," he said. "We chalked it for the new ones so they'd learn the turns." They all learned. His stitches pulled when he swallowed. The alley walls bore marks that were not writing until you looked at them long enough. Fingernails had drawn in little arcs, always 4 in a set, then a gap, then 4 again. At hip height, a band of girders had polished bright, kissed by the brush of passing bodies. At knee height, a scuff line ran unbroken, the record of steps set exactly the same way thousands upon thousands of times. Serial brushed the scuff with her glove. A grit-like ground enamel clung to the pad. Hestian paused at a door whose number had been scratched off and re-scratched and finally abandoned. He pressed the latch. It swung inward on a room paired to its use. 2 cots, a shelf, a stove with 3 scars where pots had sat until their bottoms mapped the heat. A string hung across the ceiling. From it dangled a tin ring the size of a jaw, suspended at eye level by 2 threads, so that it could turn and always return to stillness facing the same way. On the shelf below, a child's pick slate lay open to a sketch, a circle of stick figures, and in the middle a black square the child had filled with the blunt end of a stylus until the grain showed through. Under it the child had tried to write a word and managed only the first letter 3 times, each with less pressure than the last. Callias moved through to the next room and the next. In each some small object had been arranged to face the door, a spoon balanced across a cup, a pair of boots placed heel to heel, a comb set teeth down into a bar of cheap soap. Marks of a people who expected to be checked, who wanted to be seen in order, as if good arrangement could secure safe return. He set nothing out of alignment as he passed. It was not superstition, it was respect for ghosts that might have measured the same distances by hand. The whispering began as pressure. Hestian felt it first along the line where mask met skin. A hush that was too deliberate to be air was moving through the habs, a draft that did not stir cloth, but persuaded the inner ear to lean toward it. Serial lifted her lamp without being told and extinguished it entirely for a beat, letting the dark bloom to see whether the sound required light to travel. It did not. In the black something spoke to the part of the mind that keeps names, a muscle memory of introductions. She relit. The whisper slid away, not offended, merely continuing elsewhere. "Do not answer," Albin said, not pleading, just reciting the rule that had been hammered into bone. "Even in your head, answering counts." "Counts toward what?" Callias asked. "The ring," Albin said. He blinked and his eyelids seemed surprised to find his eyes still there. "Everything counts toward the ring. They reached the communal refectory, a long low hall whose ceiling had been reinforced with salvaged plates stamped with decades of manufactorum dates. Tables filled the room in ranks. Each seat had been carved with a notch, an index for knees, so that when bodies sat they made a pattern. The vents could learn and feed. Along the far wall, a bank of old vending units stood open. Their interiors had been stripped of coils and motors and refilled with something like shrines. Clusters of little tin masks stacked like coins, jawless mouths turned outward. Between the masks lay lengths of cord braided from cloth torn to uniform widths, cords long enough to string a room hand to hand in a single circlet. Serial crouched at the center of the hall. The floor bore a faint ring where something heavy had been dragged and set down and dragged and set down again until the concrete remembered the motion in its pores. In the ring's center, a drain had been cut after the fact, the edges still raw, the grate made from a stove rack. The smell that rose from it was not rot, it was the flat, almost tranquil smell of water left to stand in a dark place for a long time. Hestian looked up. The walls wore posters from a time before the silence, their propaganda softened by steam into a kind of kindness they had not meant to have. Citizens are the Imperium's strongest machine. Work is prayer made visible. The posters had been amended with chalk in a neat hand. Hold hands, count steps, do not look back when you hear your name. Between two slogans, a child had drawn a narrow staircase that disappeared into a black rectangle, and above it in shaky letters, "Hush goes down." The whisper passed again, closer, catching on the edges of the words as if sampling them. Serial's visor fogged until she steadied her breathing. Callias glanced at Hestian. The Inquisitor tilted his head toward a hatch, half hidden behind a length of hanging laundry that had petrified where it dripped. Albin nodded, shame and relief sharing the same brief expression. "Yes," he said. "There." Hestian pulled the laundry aside and found a maintenance hatch framed by warning chevrons. The hinges had been oiled recently enough that the oil still gleamed. He loosened the wheel and felt the pressure of air against his glove, the gentle insistence of a space that would rather remain closed. The wheel turned, the seal released with a sigh that did not echo. Beyond, a crawl space dropped into a deeper hush. The whisper pooled there, thickened, separated into strands like hair in water. Serial angled her lamp and revealed the first meter of descent, handholds worn to smoothness, knee prints impressed into dust like fossils made yesterday. A scrap of cloth knotted at the third rung as a marker for a child's reach. The smell rose, clean in its way, the mineral coolness of stone licked into polish by breath and time. Hestian looked back at his retinue, at Callias' set jaw, at Serial's steady hands, at Albin's mask where it shivered against his chest. He said nothing. He swung into the hatch and began to descend into the place where the hive stopped being built and started being taught. The whisper followed like a tide slipping into a cave.
The crawl space bent them into shapes the hive preferred. Elbows tucked, shoulders turned, weapons held close to avoid catching on the rivet heads that studded the ribs. Stone gave way to poured composite, and then to brick older than the hab itself, reclaimed from a city that had once stood on this spot, before the hive rose like a replacement spine. The whisper became directional, not sound but guidance, a current that tugged at the inner ear the way gravity tugs at a cup set near a table's edge. Hestian paused where handholds turned sideways and sniffed the air. It held a faint carbohydrate sweetness. Porridge burned thin and left to crust. People had fed here long after the markets closed. The shaft opened onto a crawlway high along the wall of a chamber the size of a transit hall turned inside out. What had once been ventilation had been amended by human hands until it resembled an amphitheater laid on its side. Ramps spiraled down to a floor cut with rings, each ring braided from cloth cords knotted through eyelets welded into the concrete. The rings could tighten and slacken by a clever system of pulleys, all controlled from a dais where a lever with a child's handprint worn into its paint waited for a particular grip. Around the dais, chalk marks recorded tallies and corrections, the arithmetic of a task learned by rote. Sariel's lamp found a stack of slate tablets scuffed by small wrists and the faint imprint of a teacher's palm, where it had pressed beside a sentence to steady it. The sentence repeated, "Hold hands, keep breath, do not answer the name." Callias tracked the perimeter with his muzzle and counted exits. 2 service doors, both boarded from this side with bolts set to turn easily. Not prison, corral. He tested one bolt. It moved with the slow dignity of a hinge that has learned not to squeal during prayer. Brother Alban watched, face slack with a tired shame that had no need for performance. "We kept them together," he said. "It's safer if no one runs the wrong way. The ducks fork, they get lost." He swallowed, and the stitches puckered like a tightened drawstring. "That is what I told myself." Hestian descended the ramp without comment, reading while he walked. The cloth cords were braided from rags dyed Ministorum red, Mechanicus black, Administratum gray, uniforms reduced to strands and woven into obedience. The eyelets glittered with oil new enough to stain his glove. At the center of the floor a square mouth had been cut, not the shaft from the cavern, but kin to it, smaller, lined with brick that sweated clean water in a slow sainted ooze. The whisper was strongest there, but not vocal. It worked at the attention the way a magnet works at a compass, tilting it again and again toward the dark. He stood with the toe of one boot on the ring's inner cord and watched the bricks breathe. The movement was not true expansion. It was the mind catching at irregularities and finding in them a rhythm. Human perception is a liturgy too. Sariel crouched near the dais and examined the lever. It had 2 stops marked with wax. Gather and loose. She slid a probe under the housing and found the pulley line that ran under the floor. Where it crossed a beam, hair had caught and twisted into a thin rope, pale and brittle. She set it down with care, as if setting down a strand of time. Callias lifted a hatch that had been cut into the floor just outside the ring. Beneath lay a low crawl with a row of bowls sunk into the concrete, each under a grill. The bowls were stained with a dark varnish, where hands had dipped and thrown pinches of salt in practiced flicks. He tasted the air and his mouth watered against his will. The body knows ritual even when the mind has not learned it. He jerked his head as if to clear a fly. "Someone engineered this," he said, anger controlled to a fine edge. "Not just the Mechanicus, parents, overseers, people who loved what they feared. Love and fear teach the same lessons if you give them enough time," Hestian said. He drew a chalk tally with his gloved finger in the dust, allowed himself one small imprecision, and watched how wrongness felt under his skin. The whisper leaned toward the error like a tongue toward a cut. He erased the mark. The lean subsided. "It prefers order. It does not require it." Brother Alban had drifted to the dais without taking steps that any of them saw. Habits move a man like tides. He stopped with his hands half raised, as if the old muscle knew where they belonged and the new conscience had grabbed them mid-air. "I pulled it to gather," he said, at the word. We waited for the second word. Sometimes the second word came from the pipes, sometimes from nowhere. His eyes were wet, but not from grief. The ducks breathed on him and cooled the salt there. It forgave us when we kept the pace. Sariel's auspex ticked against her hip. A small insect sound like a conscience with formal training. She glanced at it and frowned. The needle did not point to mass. It pointed to a subtraction. A clean-edged lack where there should have been solid wall. She followed the absence and found a panel so precisely fitted that it read as seamless. Heat had left its shadow there recently. Not heat the way a forge leaves heat, but a warmness like breathed air close to skin. She pressed her palm flat. Something breathed in answer, and the whisper swelled until it felt like a hand around the back of her neck, not squeezing, just owning the angle. Callias saw the set of her shoulders and came to stand at her right, weapon low and ready. Hestian climbed the last meter to join them, his shadow stretching across the ring. He tapped the panel twice with his knuckle, and once with the edge of his rosarius. The sound returned oddly, as if a room on the other side were choked with fabric. He did not step back. "Open it," he said, and he did not direct the order at Sariel or Callias. Brother Alban flinched as if a lash had found him. He reached slowly, reverently, and slid his fingers under a lip so fine it might have been cut with a prayer.
The panel came away without a squeal. Out behind lay a nursery's idea of a sacristy. Low shelves, little hooks, a mat woven from rags. On the hooks hung more tin masks, these sized for the faces that leave teeth in apples. On the shelves small bowls waited, each labeled with a name in a neat hand, each bowl empty and clean and dry. The floor held a grid of scuffs where small feet had been arranged, patient and correct, until the game ceased to be pretend. Sariel stood very still, the auspex needle steadied, the lac resolved into the room's clean shape. They made them ready here, she said, voice even because it had to be, so it would speak through them without breaking them all at once. Brother Albin's hands had lowered to his sides. His mask swung and tapped his ribs. We told stories, he said, about how the Emperor once spoke through the mouths of babes to shame the faithless. We did not say it was here. We asked them to be brave. He looked at Hestian with a nakedness that was not courage and not cowardice, but the place where both end. Do not ask if I believed it. I believed what I could survive believing. The whisper braided through the room in narrow strands and then gathered itself like a singer filling lungs. The bowls on the shelf did not move, but the names written on their rims seemed, for a blink too long, to adjust their strokes, as if chalk could turn its face. Kalia's finger tightened on his trigger until the guard kissed the glove. Hestian lifted his hand a centimeter. Not yet. A draft crossed the chamber, faint and contained, like air drawn through a reed. The voice that followed did not come from the panel, or the rings or the shaft beneath the brick. It came from the space between Hestian's raised hand and the air itself. It said his name first, Hestian. The sound was exact and echoed by nothing. It landed in the room like a weight in a bowl you had forgotten you were carrying. Brother Albin made a small sound. The noise of a stitch popped by a breath too deep. Sariel's pupils contracted, the lamp haloed a little wider without brightening. Albin, the voice did not hurry to repeat itself. It had learned patience along with them. When it spoke again, it placed a second name beside the first like a matching cuff. Sariel. Kalia's jaw worked once, not in fear, but in the calculation of angles. The voice allowed that calculation its second, as if manners mattered to it, then laid down a third name with the care of a clerk setting a seal. Callias. The rings on the floor crept a finger's breadth tighter, though no hand touched the lever. The whisper thinned to a thread that ran from each of their throats to the dark at the room's middle, a string drawn straight and waiting.
Hestian lowered his hand, the distance of a blade's thickness, and the room seemed to relax around the motion, as if etiquette had been satisfied. He did not answer. He closed his fingers until the Rosarius pressed a small crescent into his palm, and let the small clean pane become a metronome against the pull to speak. Sariel exhaled through her nose, a measured tide that kept the name from finding purchase on her tongue. Callias's visor tilted the barest degree, acknowledging that each of them had heard and none had erred. Brother Albin's face had the look of a man reliving an instruction he had both obeyed and broken. He whispered without voice, lips forming a ministorum counter-litany that spoke of silence as fidelity. The stitch line at his mouth tugged along with the words that never left. The thread between their throats and the center of the room drew a fraction tighter, not enough to choke, enough to remind. The rings on the floor eased inward again of their own accord. The lever did not move, the chords did, as if the dais were an idea, and the ring an instinct. Sariel's auspex ticked twice in a rising interval and steadied. Amplitude rising, she said softly. Not power, attention. Hestian pivoted his lamp from the nursery shelf to the square mouth in the floor. The brick throat below reflected nothing. He turned the beam aside and stepped once, placing his boot exactly on the scuff of a small heel mark that had polished the concrete to a sheen. You preferred the smallest first, he said. It was not a question. His voice lived on the surface of the words, stripped clean of accusation and comfort both. Albin nodded once. All rings need a light center, he answered, as if reciting a physics he had been made to memorize. They do not pull so hard if the middle is brave. Callias moved to the dais. He rested 2 fingers on the lever, not to pull, but to feel the lever's learning, the ghost of 1,000 grips. Beneath his glove, The paint was worn to metal at the exact place. A child's hand ended, and an adult's began. He looked to Hestian. A slight shake of the Inquisitor's head said no. The lever's movement would be the ring's word, and he would not give the room its cue. Sariel, Hestian said, and the sound of her name from him, under control, cut the thin line the other voice had drawn through it. Trace me a path from this nursery to a junction that is not auto-routed by Ministorum or Mechanicus braid. A third wrote. She nodded, and began to read the walls with her fingertips. The Habs felt their own wiring, the way people feel scars, not by sight, by memory. She found a conduit run, that had been painted in the same dull color as the masonry, but whose screws were newer by a decade. She knuckled the plate. It answered with a hollow domestic sound, the small drum of a wall where a cupboard has been removed. She slid her blade into the seam and levered. The panel gave without protest to reveal a narrow chase, not a duct, a space left by habit when a wall is built around things too inconvenient to move. Inside, a trunk cable the width of her wrist ran downward, wrapped not in red or black braid, but in miserliness. Bindings cut from bedsheets and tied in sailor's knots. Found you, she murmured, and the room rewarded her with a soft deepening of the whisper, like a teacher pleased by a correct line on a slate. Callias's teeth touched with a sound only he noticed. It wants us to follow, he said. Hestian stepped to the chase and laid 2 fingers on the poor binding. The cloth was warm, not hot. Warm the way skin is warm when another skin has been there. He looked at Brother Alban. Who tied these? Alban's eyes dropped to the floor, not to avoid the answer but to find the right address for it. Mothers, he said. Fathers, those who are good with knots. And if you had to cut them. We did not, he said, and in the crack before he added, we were not told to. A small courage glinted and was gone. The voice in the center spoke again. It did not repeat their names. It offered a fourth, one belonging to no one in the room. The syllables had the round softness of a young mouth learning to read. The sound landed in the nursery like a toy set back in its proper place. Alban flinched hard enough to pull a stitch. Hestian's head turned by a fraction. You withheld, he said, still not a question. Alban's nod was almost a bow. We made a list inside the list, the ring keeper said, the confession coming as a relief that sickened him even as it washed through. We kept some names from the slate. We erased them and then wrote them in our heads. We gave the voice the others. We gave it the ones who would be brave, and the ones who would not. He stopped, as if he had found a wall inside himself, and could not decide whether to climb it. We told ourselves the Emperor would see the withheld ones, and send a custodian guard to take them away to safety. We told ourselves many things. Did it come to collect them? Callias asked. And the mercy in his tone was the kind made of dry bread and cold water. Alban's laugh was a single sound with no mirth and no contempt in it. Something came. The cord between their throats and the dark tugged again, a child's pressure, the way one tugs a sleeve in the market. Hestian ignored it in the absolute way. Only certain kinds of discipline make possible. We will cut the third rote, he said. When it reaches for us, it will find its hand empty. Sariel. She had already worked the binding loose and brought out her cutters. The tool bit the makeshift braid and pinched. The whisper thinned at once, as if a hollowness had opened in it. The rings on the floor slackened a fraction, not under the lever, under a law of attention denied. The voice did not speak for the space of a breath. When it returned, it tried a word that was not a name. Hestian had heard it in machine rituals on forged ships, in the low tones of an engine seer calming a reactor's loud humility. It sounded like a request to synchronize. No, he said, to the room, to the brick mouth, to the habit that had learned them. You may not have the pace. Callias's eyes flicked to the nursery hooks. A small mask swung without draft, turning its hollow mouth toward the dark, so the empty could address the emptier. He stepped between it and the shaft almost gently, as if to block a draft, and the whisper grudged him the space without argument. Sariel severed the second knot. The auspex needle came off its stop and wavered like a compass, asked whether north is still north. She cut a third. The whisper guttered. The cords eased. The room, bare as it was, felt briefly like a place where people might have sat on the floor because the floor was cool, and it was summer, and they were tired. Hestian looked at Albin. There will be a power manifold below. Show me. Do not tell me you cannot. We are beyond that turn. Albin swallowed, and the motion tugged his stitches like a seam under strain. There is a switch, he said. It is not a Mechanicus switch, it is a house switch. We set it tonight when the day shift was done. It did not like that, so we learned to like what it liked. He gestured toward a low door behind the dais, almost invisible from above eye level. Either. They went through together, Kellius first, Serial behind with her tools and her lamp, Hestian last with Albin in the field of his shadow. The door opened into a recess barely large enough for 3 men to crouch. In its wall a wooden box had been fixed, planed smooth by palms. The lid bore a pencil line where someone had once drawn a childish aquila and then rubbed it out, until only the pressure of the graphite remained. Inside were fuse knives scavenged from kitchen stoves, wired in parallel with care. Beside them a single rocker sat, the kind sold in markets for dorm lamps. It had been labeled in pencil, and then in ink, and then in paint, each layer a deeper insistence, until the word had buried the wood's grain. Ring. Serial angled the lamp and glanced to Hestian. He gave one small nod. She touched the rocker with the back of her knuckle, as if testing a patient's skin. Then she pushed it to off. Nothing dramatic happened. No thunder, no scream. The whisper went out like a candle under a glass. The ring cords relaxed with a small shiver that could have been fabric, remembering it was fabric. Somewhere deep in the brick, a bubble rose and broke without sound. The silence that followed was not the bad silence of the hive's first greeting. It was the fragile quiet of a room after a child has fallen asleep and you are trying not to wake them because you love them and because you need for a minute to think. Brother Albin closed his eyes. When he opened them, the stitches at his mouth looked less like a boundary. It will come back, he said, but there was no faith in the promise and no dread, only fact. Hestian touched the fuse knives with certainty, memorizing their order. Then we will meet it where circuits end, he said. Not as singers, as witnesses. From the transit side of the Habs, a sound rose, not the voice, not the whisper, not a machine, a human sound, small and hoarse and possible. It came again, a cough and the swallow after. Kellius's head snapped toward the corridor. Serial's lamp lifted, and for the first time since they had set foot on the world, the silence gave them an answer that belonged unequivocally to the living.
Chapter 4. The Masked Truths of the Ordos. They found the cough behind a barricade of meal crates, stacked into a shallow V, the sort of fort a child makes when they have learned that solid lines comfort adults. A boy crouched within, ribs lathering his skin under a worker's shirt cut down to size. His hair had been shorn with a dull blade and grown back in stubborn bristle. A tin mask lay in his lap like a toy put aside. His eyes were open and sensible. He did not start when the lamps fell on him. He blinked once, not at the light, at their faces, as if sorting them by shape and function. Hestian knelt without touching him, and lowered his own profile to the boy's height. Between them, the mask stared upward with its blank mouth. "What's your name?" Hestian asked. And the word was a bridge, laid stone by stone, not a net thrown. The boy swallowed, felt the old rule rise, felt it falter. "Perrin," he said, and his mouth did not split on the stitches, because he had never been given them. Someone had withheld him in truth, not in chalk. "Perrin Leo." He tapped the mask with 2 fingers, and then took his hand away, as if it might bite. "They wanted me to be brave later." Serail passed a canteen under the crates, the spout folded back, so he could drink without lifting it. Perrin took a measured swallow, and handed it back with a gratitude learned in places where gratitude had to be precise. Callius scanned the corridor with his muzzle, and listened in the way soldiers do when they are counting moving parts that are not machines. No other breath came. The Habs held this single small human, like a pinprick of heat on an auspex slate, gone cold. Brother Albin stood 2 steps back, hands at his sides, as if setting them anywhere else would rewrite what they had been used for. He spoke to the floor. His name is not on the slate, he said, nor in the clerk's book. I remember it because I had to forget it. Hestian nodded once, not as indulgence, as annotation. He rose and offered Perrin a strap of dried ration. The boy took it without grabbing. We're leaving, Hestian said. You'll walk between us. If you hear someone say your name, and it is not one of us, you keep your feet. Perrin nodded with the same seriousness he had used to drink. They moved, the boy bracketed by carapace and cloak, past the sleeping ring, past the fuse box labeled like a prayer, up into the habs where the whispers were now, only walls learning their new quiet. At the basilica's nave, the air had changed. It carried the faintest tang of ozone and machine oil cut with sanctified unguents. Serail tilted her head and caught it before the others did. The mingled signatures of two cloisters that rarely share a room without argument. Metal feet met stone, somewhere beyond the transept. The sound was careful enough to be courteous and loud enough to be heard. Callias' visor marked a tight smile in the corner of his mouth. Guests. They stepped into the open and faced a wedge of Skitarii in burnished plate, optic sensors winking like patient stars in a smog sky. Their galvanic rifles rested at an angle that promised speed without suggesting panic. Between their shoulders moved two robed figures whose vestments announced their houses as crisply as any heraldry, one in the red of the Adeptus Mechanicus, cables rosarying from neck to wrist, the other in Ministorum black pinned with silver cogwork as if to prove it could. Behind them, descending the nave with measured paces, came a woman in a long coat that translated as authority in any dialect. Her rosette sat on her breast like a modest sun. Her hair was bound without ornament. She had the sort of face upon which irony would have looked like mutiny. Inquisitor Magda Vey, of the Ordo Hereticus, crossed the nave as if the stone had been laid to bear precisely this weight. She stopped with 3 meters of air between her and Hestian, and let the greeting happen in the silence that radiates from old acquaintance. A beat later, she inclined her head by a degree that could fit in a legal text. Hestian, she said, and her voice kept its paperwork in order. You do choose your vacations. He returned the degree with a micron of warmth. Vey, your timing is flawless. The same might be said of your discretion, she replied, eyes flicking once to the boy and once to Brother Albin's swinging mask. I would ask if you have secured the site, but I suspect the site is not given to the comforts of security. The Mechanicus representative bowed at the hinge, a movement more articulation than courtesy. Ingensier Prime Carados spoke in a voice filtered by devotion and smoke. We registered anomalous choir resonance and an unreported re-routing of sub-hab power. Our Skitarii came to assist in service restoration and doctrinal audit. His mechadendrites tasted the air and tucked themselves neatly again. We find also inquisitors. The Omnissiah is bountiful. The black-robed cleric at his side smiled without teeth. Brother Confessor Tiller, attached to the diocesan synod, he said. We were en route to take custody of relics and secure the orthodoxy of the record. His glance took in the scraped saint and did not register dismay. You have found a liturgical irregularity. Call it that again, and I will have you serve a month in a sump, Vey said without looking at him. It was not a threat, it was a line item. To Hestian, she added, astropathic silence persists. Vox relays are dead as law. My cutter burned atmosphere cordon and followed your transponder. I suspect we are the only ones here who are not memorialized already. Speak first, and I will decide how much to interrupt. Hestian did not tell the story in sequence. He laid down its load-bearing timbers, the emptied manufactoria, the sermons wired through confessionals, the ring machines and their household switch, the names withheld inside the lists, the nursery behind the wall, the voice that spoke in the straight line between breath and need. He spared no comfort and offered no ornament. When he ended, he put Perrin forward a step by the lightest touch of his palm. The boy endured the scrutiny with farm stillness, learned in a place without farms. Vey's eyes softened by an increment no one who did not know her would have seen. Ingensier Carados' optics narrowed in a focus that was joy by his order's measure. Brother Confessor Tiller folded his hands behind his back to keep them from making the shapes of homily. There are precedents. Vay's hand twitched, and Ascatarius's rifle angled in a new way that made precedent uneconomical. "Brother Confessor," she said, with the charity of a blade ground to perfection, "there are precedents for burning cities and calling them cauterized. We will use other words here." Carados' vox clicked in thought. Emergent resonant entity or phenomena localized to architecture and population rhythm. Not daemon, by default. Not machine conscious by design. Acquire engine grown beyond conduit, a structure that learned and asked to be fed. He was not excited, but the closest Mechanicus come to it. It may be possible to map its vectors, to isolate the amplification pathways, to determine whether the signal leaked inward from the noosphere or outward from local habit. It asked for names, Serial said, and the way she said it put a shape around the sentence that kept it from slipping away into category. It turned the liturgy into a ring, and you turned the ring off with a house switch, Vay said, looking at Hestian with an expression that entertained the possibility of laughter someday at someone else's expense. Then she glanced at Perrin again, and the possibility dissolved. "We have three choices by tradition," she continued, "not as a debate, as a ledger. Isolate and study. Exercise and purge, redact and quarantine, until the next catastrophe reuses the paperwork. And a fourth," Hestian said, as if noting a corridor that Blueprint had neglected. "Witness, then cut the feed where it starts, not where it ends. The choir engine is a symptom. The sickness is the way the Imperium teaches its people to march." Tiller drew breath for offense, and thought better of it in the face of a boy calmly holding a canteen, as if it were a relic. Carados' mechadendrites flexed, tasting the air again where the whisper had been. "We will require access to the sub-basement, and to the junction that joins civic and ecclesial grids," he said. "If a lockout was denied by a higher seal, it is recorded. Authority leaves footprints." Vay's rosette flashed once in the edging light, like a coin underwater. "Then we read the footprints," she said. "But hear me all of you, nothing leaves this world broadcast without my seal, and Hestian's. The Ordo Xenos will cry alien method. The Ordo Malleus will cry warp resonance. The Ordo Sicarius will cry need to know, and none of them will be completely wrong. The only thing that will be entirely wrong is to put this into the news feeds where frightened functionaries can learn it as a prayer." She looked up into the dark of the nave, where the saint's scraped mirror refused to hold a face. "People will do terrible things, if given even a rumor of a mechanism that listens." Callias let a slow breath leave him. "So we go down again," he said, "and we decide which of your three mercies feels least like doctrine." "Not doctrine," Vay said, and there in the middle of her voice was the smallest, strangest wound. "Duty." The Scutari adjusted their formation by a hair. Carados' robes whispered like disciplined smoke. Tiller tucked his hands deeper out of mischief's reach. Perrin stood very straight, because adults were looking, and he had learned that adults calibrate their judgment by straightness. Hestian looked to the floor, where the ring had once hummed, and then to the boy, and then to the stairs, whose stone remembered many knees. The hive waited, patient as geology. "Down," he said. The descent with Vay's wedge was different from the first. The air learned a new discipline when Scutari marched through it. Their steps set a metronome the hive could not ignore. Censer smoke from Brother Confessor Tiller's thurible, braided with machine unct in a truce that would not outlast the corridor. Engine seer Prime Carados hissed Ben Herrick to the walls, in short, courteous questions, and the conduits replied with a hum like polite gossip. Perrin walked between Serial and Ascatarius, whose face was a polished innocence of brass, and the boy matched his stride to the augmented soldiers without asking permission, as if precision were a language he had always known, and now finally heard spoken properly. They reached the civic junction where Ministorum braid met Mechanicus cable, in a marriage of necessity. The manifold squatted in a pit like a shrine, gone to seed. A dozen fused panels overlaid with decades of repairs, each plate stamped by a different manufactorum, each screw head burred by a different temper of impatience. Carados's mechadendrites unfolded with the prim, domestic air of a librarian, confronted with a desk piled with unshelved books. "Power allotment is braided," he murmured.
liturgical overlay in red, civic grid in black, unauthorized third pathway, cloth-bound, a pause, pleased in a way he would never call pleasure. You were truthful. They stepped to the edge and looked down, as if the pit owed her a confession. Show me the lockout denial. Carados's optics tightened to a needle. His augmetic fingers pried aside a plate with the care of a surgeon respecting scar tissue. Beneath lay a seal plate lacquered with lacquer older than any of them, its surface stamped with 3 rosaces, Administratum Mechanicus, and a small neat sigil of the Ordo that had no outer ring. Hestian and Vey both recognized it in the same breath. Malleus, old style, filed to discretion. The edges of the seal were puckered where heat had once kissed it to set its authority. 2 authorizations, Carados said, 1 civilian, 1 ecclesial, and a 3rd, Ordo Malleus observation. His mechadendrite tapped a line of Benheric. Lockout request received. Lockout denied. Reason resonance stability projecting manageable amplitude if ring geometries maintained. Recommendation increase minor rings for diffusion. Tiller's hand tightened on the thurible until the chain whispered. They prescribed children, he said, and his voice did not rise because some things are so unclean that shouting would dignify them. Vey's expression did not change, but the muscles around her eyes set as if she had bitten down on iron. Who signed? Carados isolated the seal code with a proud little click. The Corps spat the name after a short duel with dust. Deputy Prefect Vardell, Subsector Resource Allocation Office, he read. Co-signed by Diocesan Canon Adjunct Merlot. Observed by Inquisitor Legate Corin, Ordo Malleus. The last name lay on the air as a weight from an old ledger. Hestian knew the name. He did not let the knowledge travel to his face. Dates Carados gave them. The signatures lay months before the last Vox traffic had died. Perrin stared at the stamped metal with a boy's calm lack of interest in names that cannot be eaten or worn. Vey exhaled once, thin as a paper cut. So the ring was doctrine, she said. The silence was policy, and the thing that learned us was given the curriculum. Brother Alban swayed and then righted himself, as if the truth had rethreaded his joints. We were told to be obedient, he said. We were obedient. No plea, no excuse, a diagnosis. Carius' visor scarcely moved. Does Malleus still hold Corin? He asked. Retired or burned, Vey said. It is difficult to tell when men file their exits well. Carados's mechadendrites went still, then flared in alarm. Amplitude shift, he said. Someone is restoring feed on a separate leg. Serial's lamp snapped to the far side of the manifold, where a panel that had looked like wall a moment before now wore the sheen of hands. The cloth-bound conduit they had cut in the deep habs had brothers. This one ran under the floor in a friendly domestic line that had been painted over, then worn to visibility by years. It vanished through a rust-lipped aperture into a passage lit by the low animal glow of emergency strips that had never learned to die. Vey's hand twitched, and the Skitari wedge pivoted as one to face the opening. Tiller whispered an exorcist's opening clause and then stopped on the second word, as if the prayer were more dangerous than the dark. Hestian and Carados exchanged a look that made a bridge between 2 schools of severity. If someone is refeeding the ring, Hestian said, they are either a fool, a believer, or a rival, or us, Vey said, almost idly. We have walked in plenty of rooms where our own shadow was the most dangerous occupant. She gestured forward. The passage felt newer than the rest of the hive, as if it had been cut after the city had already learned to breathe. The floor had been textured for grip and then polished by traffic into a sheen a child could have skated on. At its end, a door waited. No shrine mark, no cog, no aquila, just a plate of black metal veined faintly with gray like cooled lava. Hexagrammatic words had been scribed into the threshold in chalk that had not yet surrendered to damp. Vey stopped, her eyes flicking once in approval and once in irritation. Malleus has been here, she said. Or someone wearing their habits. She traced one word with a gloved finger. It was correct, and slightly wrong, as if the scribe's hand had had to remember too quickly. Carados studied the door with respect he would have applied to a prototype. Non-ferrous composite, not true blackstone, but engineered to discouraging harmonics. His mechadendrite hovered over a lock that was not a lock so much as an absence shaped like permission. It wants the right pressure, not the right key. Perrin stared at the chalk, as if it were a game he had learned, and decided not to play again. Hestian crouched to bring his eyes level with the wards. The chalk whorls had been scuffed in 2 places by boots that dragged slightly on the right. Malleus came through in a hurry, he said. They did not reseal with prayer, they resealed with hope. Vey tilted her head. I dislike hope, she said. It spoils evidence. She looked to Carados. Open it. The engineer set his palm against the plate and hummed a note that made the door distrust him less. A second note followed, and the plate warmed the way a cat warms under a hand it has decided to endure. The panel sighed inward, not ajar, just willing, and the smell that rolled out was not the brine of the shaft, nor the incense of the basilica. It was the bad clean of a room kept sterile, not for health, but to prevent memory from sticking. Lights came up in a pale ritual dawn. Inside an office waited, not grand, careful. A desk with no drawers sat against the wall, its top swept empty, except for a vox recorder and a sheaf of forms under a clean stone. A chair faced the desk, the kind that makes men wait their turn with their dignity intact and their patience eroded. On the far wall, a pinboard carried 3 maps, the Hive, the city the Hive had replaced, and a diagram of rings overlaid upon both like a ghost's idea of arteries. Lines of red thread connected names to routes, and the routes to numbers. At the bottom corner of the board, a child's sticker of a saint had been stuck, and then pried up half a finger's breadth, as if a small hand had wanted it to look, as if it were flying. Tiller's breath left him in a word that was not a prayer, and not its opposite. Administration. Hestian lifted the stone, and turned the forms. They were requisitions, clean and properly copied, signed in careful hands. Requests for salt, requests for cloth, requests for masks, requests for authorization to adjust shift hours to coordinate with acoustic maintenance cycles. Each bore a signature and a seal from an office that, in the right light, could be mistaken for mercy. He set the papers down as if they were bones. They thumbed the vox recorder. A voice filled the room, low and crisp, the cadence of a woman who had learned to hold her breath between sentences to keep from saying too much. Deputy Prefect Vardell, Day 132, it said. Observational memo. Ring geometries holding. Yield within the band. Children integrate at a rate exceeding projections. Parish expresses concern, and then gratitude. Mechanicus expresses curiosity, and then confidence. Inquisitor Legate Corin expresses nothing. We proceed. A pause. Paper moving. Addendum. My sister asked if the boys will keep their teeth. I told her yes. I do not know why I told her this. The recorder clicked and hummed, and the next entry began without prompting. Day 171. Amplitude stable. Requests for names increase but are not insistent. We are advised to withhold names from those slated for off-world labor levy as a precaution. Our projections suggest that those withheld will hold their breath for longer when required. I do not know why this makes me think of school. There was a ring on the ground. We would stand and hold hands. We were told it made us brave. We were told many things. They stopped the machine with a precise touch. The room carried the echo like frost. She turned to Hestian, and for a moment the mask of office let through a flash of something old and personal. We are not going to study this, she said. We are going to end it, and then write it as a lesson for those who think a faith can be tuned like a valve. Carados' optics flared amber. Ending requires certainty, he said. The phenomenon has not expressed malice, it has expressed need. If we misidentify its vector, then the next hive will learn a better ring, they said, and the patience in her tone was the sort used to decant acid. You will have your certainty in the time I give you, and not a heartbeat more. From the corridor behind them, a sound rose, a soft, polite chime, as if a bell had been rung not to summon, but to advise that someone had stepped across a threshold they should not have. Callias turned. The Skitari shifted. Perrin's fingers tightened on the tin mask until it bit his palm. Somewhere beyond the chalk wards, the whisper learned a new route and began to return.
The chime rang again. This time not as a courtesy, but as a summons. It reverberated through the junction, a tone too polite to be alarm and too deliberate to be accident. The Skitarii fanned out instantly, rifles angled into the shadows. Adeptus Mechanicus froze mid-air like hunting animals, waiting for the leash. Tiller clutched his thurible tighter, the incense smoke wreathing around his face as if to shield him. Vay's hand rested near her rosette, though she did not touch it. There are weapons of authority that lose their edge when handled too quickly. From the far corridor, figures emerged, not Skitarii, not troopers, a procession, 4 acolytes in robes too clean for this hive, their steps measured, their faces hidden behind masks of hammered tin polished to a cruel shine. The masks were different from the crude nursery versions. These were worked with artistry, filigreed at the edges, eye holes cut to exact ovals, jaws open as if forever mid-syllable. Between them walked a figure taller than the rest, armored in black plate that had once been ceremonial, but was now repurposed as function. A rosette glimmered faintly at his collar. Inquisitor Hestian, the figure said, voice echoing through a vox grill shaped like a mouth that would never close. And Magda Vay, how fortunate. He stopped 3 paces from the Skitarii line, and inclined his masked head as if acknowledging peers at a tribunal. I am Inquisitor Legate Corin, Ordo Malleus. You stand in my operation. The air in the junction thinned. Even the dust seemed to listen. Vay's eyes narrowed with a recognition tempered by distaste. Hestian's jaw shifted once, the smallest movement, as though an old suspicion had grown legs and walked out of the dark. You are dead, Vay said. Not disbelief, fact, as if she were citing a closed file. Corin tilted his head. The mask caught the light, its jaw fixed in perpetual openness. Then I am a ghost, he said. A ghost with writs you have already uncovered. My seal denied your lockout. My authority kept the ring alive. The Emperor's will is larger than your fear. Tiller stepped forward, voice rising despite the danger. You sanctified children's mouths to an engine you could not. You fed their names to something that does not wear the aquila. That is not the Emperor's will. That is heresy, dressed as patience. The acolytes behind Corin shifted, their hands visible at their sleeves, no weapons drawn, but each mask angled toward the confessor with a weight of attention that pressed like a hand on his throat. Hestian spoke, his tone a knife laid flat. What did you think you were building, Corin? The masked inquisitor spread his hands, the gesture at once priestly and judicial. Not building, discovering. The resonance was not daemon, it was not xenos, it was not machine, it was us. It was the Imperium's own rhythm, made audible. The people taught themselves to speak in chorus. I only gave them permission to continue. You have heard it. You know it is neither hunger nor malice. It is the sound of obedience given shape. Cyriel's breath rasped in her mask. It asked for names. It wanted what it had not been given. And so does the throne. Corin answered smoothly. The Emperor himself survives, because 1 billion souls each day speak his name into the Astronomicon. Why should a hive not serve an echo? Why should we not refine that service into geometry? Vay stepped forward, her coat brushing dust into small spirals. Because the Emperor does not require your refinements, Corin. He requires your obedience, and you mistook your ambition for his appetite. The silence after was taut as a bowstring. The Skitarii shifted weight in unison, barrels aligned without tremor. Ordos optics whirred, registering heat signatures that were steady, unnaturally so, like men whose pulse had been trained to match a metronome. Perrin pressed closer to Cyriel, his small hand gripping the edge of her sleeve. Corin's mask turned slightly, the fixed jaw catching the light. You would burn what you do not understand, as you always have. But the Ordos are divided. Some will call this warp taint, others xenos mimicry, others only a useful pattern to be weaponized. I am the one who chose to listen. You, Hestian, you above all should know that listening is the first act of judgment.
Hestian's reply was quiet enough to force every ear closer. Judgment requires witness, not surrender. And what I heard was not the Emperor. It was something that learned to wear his cadence. The acolytes behind Corrin breathed as one, a sound like a sigh rehearsed in drill. The whisper threaded through the junction again, brushing against the inside of masks and minds alike, tasting for permission. The Skitari's optics flickered. Tiller's thurible smoked harder as he muttered exorcisms. Ordos lifted a hand, mechadendrites twitching in unease. They did not raise her weapon, though her hand hovered near her holster like a final clause left unsigned. "So this is your truth, Corrin," she said. "A masked choir, in a dead hive, a truth that will not outlast the walls it hides in." And yet Corrin said, his mask tilting like a smile, "It is a truth you cannot unhear." The whisper thickened, filling the silence like water rising in a cistern.
Chapter Fee. Rumors Beyond the Silence. The whisper rose until the junction itself seemed to breathe. It did not roar, it did not chant, it only layered itself, syllable on syllable, until the air resembled water about to break. The Skitari stiffened as their augmetic sensors twitched to compensate. Brother Alban pressed his stitched lips together until they whitened. Perrin clung to Suriel's sleeve, the tin mask in his hand trembling as though the metal itself recognized the cadence. Then, as if a hand had been raised in a courtroom, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was too sudden to be natural. It felt imposed, deliberate. Corrin lowered his arms and let the stillness linger like a verdict. "You see," he said, "even its restraint is proof of will. That is not daemon hunger, that is choice. And choice, when it reflects the Emperor's pattern, is faith." Vay's eyes cut to Hestian, cold as steel beneath frost. "Rumors," she said softly, "have killed worlds. What happens when this one spreads? A choir that answers, a liturgy that speaks back, an emperor who lends his voice where once only silence dwelt." Her mouth hardened into something like contempt. "Half the Imperium will worship, the other half will burn those who try. Either way, billions die before truth is known." Ordos clicked through a dozen calculations, Benheric flaring behind his teeth. "Containment is mathematically implausible if transmission occurs. Pilgrims, refugees, levy tithes, any who leave will carry the rumor. Even those who did not hear will invent that they did." His optics shifted to amber. "Rumor is faster than Vox." Hestian said nothing for a long breath. He looked at Perrin, at the boy's knuckles white around the mask's edge. He looked at Alban, whose shame had calcified into an endurance that would not break. He looked at Corrin, mask gleaming, voice steady, faith reshaped into geometry. And he looked finally at Vay, who waited like someone poised to choose between executions. "The rumor is already here," he said. "We carry it. Even if we burn this hive to glass, we cannot unlearn what we have heard." Corrin inclined his head, Vox grill hissing softly. "Then let it spread, let it strengthen. The Imperium is brittle. It needs cohesion. 1,000 hive worlds chanting in unison. Do you not see? It is salvation." Tiller's thurible swung once, scattering ash across the stones. "Or damnation disguised as choir practice," he muttered, voice raw. "How many cults began with less?" Suriel shifted her lamp, its beam catching the maps pinned to the wall. She studied the rings overlaying hive and city and ruin. "It doesn't matter what we call it," she said, her voice small but steady. "Someone will find this again, maybe in another hive, maybe on a shrine world. The instructions are here." Her gloved hand touched the chalk scrawl still faint on the stones. "Do not look back when you hear your name. That's all it takes to begin. A rule, a story, a mask." Vay's jaw tightened. "Then we write the ending." She raised her hand. "Corrin, by the authority vested in me by the Golden Throne, you are to stand down, relinquish your acolytes, and submit for censure." The masked inquisitor did not move. His acolytes shifted their weight, masks catching the lamplight in hollow grins. The whisper flickered again, brushing each throat like a finger tracing a vein. Corrin's vox carried no anger, only conviction.
I answer to the Emperor alone, and he has already spoken. The Skitarii raised rifles in a single clean motion. The junction seemed to tilt, ready to collapse into fire and doctrine. But before any shot was loosed, the Vox recorder on the desk clicked of its own accord. A new voice spilled out, fainter, distorted, as if carried across too many wires. It was not Corin. It was not anyone in the room. It was the sound of 1,000 mouths whispering as one, shaped into words no one wanted to hear. We are still here. We are still waiting. Give us the names. The light strips along the corridor guttered and flared. Every mask in the room, worn and unworn, rang with a faint metallic hum. Even Corin turned his head, as though the voice had spoken without his consent. Rumors, Hestian thought, were not things one destroyed. They were seeds, and seeds had a way of sprouting whether planted in soil, in stone, or in silence.
The Vox recorder kept humming, its spool spinning. Though no hand touched it, the voice thickened, layering until it resembled a crowd outside a courthouse. Many throats shaping the same word, until the syllables blurred. Names, names, names. Each repetition struck differently. Some a plea, others a demand. Some like laughter. Perrin pressed the tin mask hard against his chest, as if its hollowness could shield him. Brother Albin clutched his own mask until the cord snapped, and the metal rang against the floor. Carados bent low, mechadendrites skimming over the recorder like insects. No signal source, he muttered. Ben Herrick clicking sharp with unease. No transmission band. This is spontaneous resonance. Machine carrying memory it should not hold. Vay's hand snapped downward, and 2 Skitarii moved as one. Rifles raised toward the device. Destroy it, she ordered. No, Corin barked, mask glinting. You destroy the voice. You destroy proof. This is continuity, not corruption. Continuity? Tiller spat, ash flecking his lips. This is an echo demanding blood. Before another word could rise, Hestian stepped forward. His cloak swept the dust into curling motes as he laid his hand atop the recorder. The whispers faltered, dipping into silence as though recognizing the weight of his palm. He closed his eyes, not in prayer, but in judgment. For a moment he looked less like an inquisitor and more like an old man, listening to a song he did not want to remember. When he lifted his hand, the recorder stilled. No click, no whir, only silence again. They will argue forever, he said softly. His gaze cut between Vay and Corin. Malleus will call it warp taint, Mechanicus will call it resonance, Ministorum will call it miracle. Each truth will wear a mask, and beneath the masks, the same hunger to own the story. Vay exhaled. Then what do you propose? Hestian looked at Perrin. The boy's grip on the mask had loosened, his eyes glazed with exhaustion. That it remains rumor, Hestian said. Nothing more. Not doctrine, not technology, not miracle. Rumor can be denied, doubted, dismissed. A weapon of paper, not iron. Carados' optics flickered. Rumor cannot be controlled. Exactly, Hestian replied. That is its mercy. Truth becomes weapon. Rumor dies in the wrong mouth. Corin laughed through the grill, a sound like air through broken teeth. Naive. Do you think silence will hold? Pilgrims will return here. Survivors will talk. The voice will spread, with or without us. Vay's hand hovered near her holster. For a heartbeat, it seemed she might draw. Then she lowered it. Perhaps, but it will spread fractured, broken. Each story contradicting the next. That is survivable. Her eyes flicked to Corin's acolytes. Not your choir. That dies here. The Skitarii moved without pause. 2 shots cracked like gongs in the close space. One acolyte crumpled before the sound fully faded. Another tried to raise a hand in protest, only for his mask to shatter under a last round. The remaining 2 fell back, not from fear but as if guided, stepping together in precise cadence. Their masks glowed faintly at the seams, a trick of light that might have been circuitry, or might have been nothing. Corin raised his arms, Vox voice ringing. You think you kill them. They are already part of it. Their rhythm is kept. But his mask tilted ever so slightly toward the recorder, as if even he feared the silence it had left behind. They stepped closer, her face stone. Legate Corin, for sanctioning heresy, for corrupting the faithful, and for permitting doctrine to become parasite. I strip you of authority in the Emperor's name. She gestured once. The Skitarii leveled rifles, and yet Hestian raised a hand. No, he said, and the word cracked through the tension. Let him live, not as an inquisitor, not as an oracle, as rumor. The room stilled. Even they blinked. Explain. If we kill him, Hestian said, he becomes martyr. If we erase him, he becomes legend. But if he lives broken, discredited, wandering, then he becomes a story no one fully believes. And rumor, as I said, is survivable. Corin's mask inclined, as if in mock gratitude, but the hiss behind the grill trembled, just once. The boy Perrin spoke then, voice quiet but clear. He can't take the names, not if we don't give them. The whisper had not returned, yet every adult in the room flinched, as though the child had brushed the hive's wound. They stared at Hestian for a long moment. Then slowly, she lowered her hand. The Skitarii did not fire. For the first time since the hive had gone silent, choice returned to the air. They moved as if a thread had been cut, and each was learning how to stand without the pull. Thea signaled the Skitarii to lower their rifles by a finger's breadth, enough to show decision, not weakness. Ordos turned to the manifold and began to unbraid the poor man's circuitry with a care bordering on tenderness, clipping the cloth-bound runs, capping live tongues of copper with resin sleeves, murmuring Benharik to calm the offended spirits. Sariel set about the room with the patience of a medic in a ward after bombardment, searching for places the rumor had been taught to sit, confessionals wired for absolution, choir boxes fitted with teeth, small switches labeled for comfort. She flipped each to off and then pulled the feeds so that off stopped meaning anything. Carius watched the corridors, visor tilted to catch the first hint of returning whisper, one boot toe resting on the chalk of a ward, as if to remind it that men could redraw lines. Brother Albin stood by the doorway, like a penitent who has been told that penance will be counted in years, not words. He held his broken mask with both hands, and it had become so light in his fingers that it was hard to remember how heavy it had felt when he wore it. Perrin sat on the edge of a crate, legs swinging once with the shy audacity of boys who need the movement to keep from falling asleep. He kept the tin jaw in his lap and did not look at it. Corin watched with the fixed calm of a man who has convinced himself that the story will circle back and absolve him if he keeps very still. You cannot cut every wire, he said, as if stating the axiom of an old proof. You cannot unteach a ring. No, Hestian said, kneeling to loosen the last tie on the recorder's cable and sliding the device into a satchel he would seal and stamp until it resembled a reliquary. We can only make it harder to find, so that those who go looking must do so in daylight and with both hands. That is often enough. They paced to the maps and tore the red thread free in slow deliberate passes, not with anger, with bookkeeping. She folded the maps once and once again until the paper cracked, and then slid them into an evidence sleeve. We will file this as an infrastructural failure with anomalous devotional side effects, she said, and the dryness of it was mercy. A dead hive, a misread choir. We will recommend immediate cessation of all liturgical augmentation projects across the subsector. We will send a letter to every canon adjunct who signed anything in the last 3 years, reminding them that faith is not measured in decibels. Ordos glanced up, optics warm with a gratitude his order rarely names. And a technical appendix, he said, almost hopeful, advising against closed-loop acoustic architectures in mass housing. Write it, they said, in language that does not teach a clever clerk how to rebuild what we have killed. Carius Vox clicked. Movement in the upper transepts, he said. Echo only. No heat. The whisper is learning the loss. Hestian looked to Albin. There are names you withheld, he said. You will keep withholding them. You will also take Perrin and anyone else you find who has not been spoken by it,
and you will walk them to my cutter. You will not look back. If you hear your own name, you will keep your feet." Albin nodded, and the motion broke something soft behind his stitched mouth. "I will count them," he said, "and I will not count them aloud." Perrin looked from Hestian to Vey to Corin, trying on, in that quick internal way of children, the faces of authority to see which belonged. He chose the one who had offered him water, and made a bridge out of his name. "Can I leave my mask here?" he asked. "So it can't find it." "You can leave it in the font," Sariel said, and her tone made the suggestion into a right. "Where the water has no memory, that is the rule we will make." He slid off the crate, and carried the tin jaw through the nave, that had held a choir engine, and now only held stone. The font was still, the thick surface taking the lamp's light without a ripple. Perrin set the mask on the lip, and tipped it in. It sank very slowly, air trapped in the curve releasing in 3 soft silvered bells. He watched until the metal lay flat, and then straightened, hands at his sides. No flourish, no pilgrimage, just the neatness of completion. Brother Albin put his broken mask beside it, and did not push. He let the water take its time, and in that patience there was contrition without spectacle. Corin spoke again, softer, as if to a confessional that had not been unwired. "You mistake rumor for mercy," he said. "It will not spare you. It will return. A ring is only a line walked long enough to meet itself." Hestian met the blank jaw's gleam with his own unornamented gaze. "Perhaps," he said, "but lines walked long enough also wear out the souls of those who insist on walking them." He turned to Vey. His fate. Vey studied Corin's mask as if it were an entry in a catalogue that had been misfiled. "You will surrender your rosette," she said. "You will leave your acolytes with me. You will not preach this in any place where a press can hear you. You will sign 3 statements you will hate, and 1 you will not understand, and you will live long enough to watch your name become a footnote no one assigns. If you refuse, we open your throat and file the paperwork. Choose." Corin's hands rose to his collar with the precision of a man rehearsing his own execution. He unclasped the chain, and set the rosette on the desk. The little sun looked smaller than it had a moment before. He did not remove the mask. He had decided it was his face now, and faces are stubborn. "You will not win," he said, and there was no grandeur in it, only a clerk's complaint. Carados finished capping the last line. The manifold hummed to a new quiet, the kind that follows a machine's first true rest in years. The air felt larger by a small hard-to-measure increment. A chamber opened inside a chest. The whisper retreated along the walls like tide withdrawing from a stone, leaving a slick that would take time to dry. They climbed. The basilica gave them back to the manufactoria with a sigh. The manufactoria returned them to the transit halls where trains had once rehearsed punctuality. At the causeway, the ash blew in a long thin curtain that never seemed to settle. The cutter sat with its ramp down, a small certainty under a sky that had forgotten electricity. Callias loaded crates without comment. Sariel ushered Perrin aboard, and handed him a blanket that smelled like a ship. Brother Albin paused at the threshold, and did not cross until Hestian nodded once, a sanction he had not known he needed until it arrived. Vey stood at the foot of the ramp, and looked back at the hive. "We will quarantine the orbit," she said. "A cordon of Navy patrols with orders to be patient and pour shots. We will seed a dozen conflicting reports. We will bury the requisitions in a reorganization. We will send stern letters to people who read stern letters, and we will move on to whatever fresh foolishness the Imperium invents next." Hestian closed his eyes, and saw the ring room, the chalk tally, the bowls with names. He saw a child's string twisted into almost Aquila. He saw a word written on a stair, not warning, but order. Hush. When he opened them, the hive had not changed, which was an honesty he could live with. "We will also remember," he said, "not to speak of it, to remember it. That is the other mercy rumor gives." The cutter's engines woke with a careful cough. Corin stood apart, no longer escorted, no longer commanding, a man in a coat with a mask that would buy him meals in some ports and a knife in others. They did not look at him again. The ramp rose, the sky took their noise and made nothing of it. As the ship lifted, the hive diminished until it was only a black comb pressed into gray. In the vox quiet of ascent, Perrin fell asleep with his hand still clenched around an invisible ring that would open, in time, into nothing more than a habit of holding on to the sleeves of people who would not sell his name. Brother Albin sat across from him and counted, eyes closed, lips still. When he reached a number that meant something only to him, he stopped and folded his hands as if at last there were a place to set them. Hestian leaned his head against cold plating and listened for a voice that did not come. In its place was the honest drone of engines, and Sariel's soft report, and Callias' scratch of a cleaning cloth along Alaskan's receiver. They stood with her back to the bulkhead, eyes on nothing, already writing the rumor she would allow to live. Somewhere far below, in stone that remembered knees, a room learned its first lesson in being empty.